Today we'll have a short reflection on this topic of taming proliferated thoughts, as this was a topic Babs has asked me to speak on. So there are actually a lot of things we could talk about. It is an important topic, right? But also can be pretty complex, right? As we all know, the starting line from the Dhammapada, isn't it? I think we all know that the Buddha says that the mind is the forerunner of all things, right? So the mind is very important, and our thoughts are obviously from the mind, okay? So the question is, when we talk about taming proliferated thoughts, all right? So that's got a lot to do with how do we actually train our mind. And I think the whole basis of the Buddha's teachings is actually about first for us to understand our mind, how our mind works, so that once we understand how our mind works, then we are able to tame it. All right? I think taming is a good word, rather than controlling our mind or controlling our thoughts, right? So that is why you find that in Buddhist teachings, irrespective of whatever schools of thought that you may follow or you may practice in, meditation is always a very important part, okay? In those of you, I'm sure you're familiar, you're used to Vipassana meditation, you may also practice Samatha meditation. So all those are aspects for us to tame our mind, so that we understand our mind better, and then we can, have a peaceful life. And that brings us to the topic, why are we all here? I think it's very important. It's very important for us to understand what is our purpose. In fact, the very reason why we are all here this morning, isn't it? I think that's a very important part. And if you look at all the Buddha's teachings, it's actually teaching us how to live at peace, not just with ourselves, but also with others. And why living with others is so important is this morning we all recite the 5 precepts, isn't it? And the 5 precepts are actually for us to live at peace with others. If we are the only person in the world, we actually don't need the 5 precepts, because there's no one for you to harm, there's no one for you to lie to, no one for you to commit sexual misconduct, all right, no one for you to steal things from. But that's unfortunately is not the case, isn't it? We live in society. So the Buddha's teachings for the past, when he taught for 45 years, has always been about how do we live at peace, not with just ourselves, but also with others. And because as human beings, we have to live in society and deal with each other. But the question is, how do we live peacefully? All right? So how are we to remain harmonious within and also within us, so that others can also live harmoniously and peacefully? All right? There's a beautiful teaching from the Jata Sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, when the Buddha have this quote. He says, "Tangles within, tangles without. People are entangled in tangles." So Bharavaja asked the Buddha, "Oh Gautama, so how can we untangle this tangle?" All right, so basically it's about the mind. Okay, so of course you can read the details in the Jata Sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya. Buddha says, a wise one of stable virtues, all right, developing the mind with wisdom. Okay, and then he says, prudent and ardent. All right, you see this word ardent, atapi, isn't it? Like in the Satipatthana Sutta, this word comes out very frequently, atapi, effort. Right? The need for us to put in effort, to tame our mind, to understand our mind, to tame our mind. And then the Buddha says to Bharavaja, then they can untangle the tangles. So it's got a lot to do with the mind. Okay? So how do we live in peace? We need to understand how our mind works. Now, to understand our mind, first we look at basic Buddhist psychology. The Buddha recognizes 2 sides of our human experience, okay? What we call the subjective or the internal senses, right? And then the objective or the external sense objects. Now, in Buddhist teachings or Buddhist psychology, you find that the Buddha does not regard the subjective to be false and objective to be true. So both the inner world of subjective experience as well as the outer world of objective experience are equally clear. So they are what we call experienceable. You can experience it. And in fact, the Buddha mentioned that our whole existence comprises nothing other than these experiences, the internal experience and the external experience. And he made it very clear in one very interesting sutta or discourse called the Sabha Sutta. Sabha Sutta, you can translate it as the all. All right, so the Buddha was once asked, what is the all? All is A-L-L, yeah? All, what is the all? So the Buddha says, monks, I will teach you the all. So what is the all? So in other words, everything. I think in another discourse, the Rohitassa Sutta, the Buddha said, within this fathom long body is the beginning of the world, the end of the world. So everything is actually within this fathom long body, right? So he says, monks, I will teach you the all. Listen and pay close attention. Then Buddha said, I will speak. Just as the Buddha told Bharavaja in the Jata Sutta, right? The tangles within, tangles without, okay? Then the monks responded, as you say. The Buddha says, what is the all? Simply the eye and forms, the ear and sounds, the nose and odor or aromas, the tongue and taste or tongue and flavors, and the body and touch sensations, the mind and ideas. So this monks is called the all. So everything is within this so-called sixth sense base. Everything your experiences, whether it's an internal experience or it's an external experience, is all within this sixth sense base. Now that is a very profound teaching, all right? But yet, when we look at it, we realize that actually it is true, okay? And that itself has got, later on, when we talk about the Madhupindika Sutta, which is related to it, it's got a lot to do with the self, all right? Or the false notion of a self, okay? Now, so as I said, just to put it in graphic forms, so when we talk about the eye sees form, the ear hears sound, all right? The nose will smell odor, the tongue will taste flavor, the body will touch an object, and the mind will perceive the thought. And that's where I think the problem starts. That's where the problem starts, and that's also where the solution is. All right? You see, the beauty of the Buddha's teachings is he does not only tell you what is the problem, he actually offers you the solution. Okay? So we'll see what is the solution. All right? Now, our thoughts, right? So we come to what is meant here. So you understand that. So the Buddha taught that our suffering is intimately connected to the process of perception. All right? This word perception or sanya, right? As some of you are familiar with. What is perception? That is the way in which we relate to thinking. And our perception has got a lot to do with our conditioning, our past conditioning, our cultural conditioning, people that we mix with, you know, the way we are brought up. So all this will influence our perception. And when concepts, all right, in the Buddhist teachings, we talk a lot about concepts, but what is important is how do we use concepts without being enthralled, without being caught up in concepts. All right. It is said that, you know, in the very famous Chinese Mahayana Sutra, the Diamond Sutra, it is said that even though the Buddha taught for, well, to the Chinese, the Buddha taught for 46 years. Because the day he was born, he was already 1 year older. So in the Theravada, we said 45 years. So that even though the Buddha has taught for more than 40 years, yet he did not utter a single word. So what does that mean? It means that even though the Buddha taught for 40 odd years, yet his words are mere concepts. He doesn't grasp concepts. Whereas all of us, whatever we say, we cling to it because of that concept of the self. Right? So which later we'll touch on. So concepts. So concepts are important. Without concepts, you cannot communicate, isn't it? You cannot communicate. You need concepts to communicate. The Pali word for concept is panyati. Panyati. So you need panyati. All right? But we should not be caught in concepts. So this word panyati and the next word papanca, you find that there's a very closely related. Yeah. So when concepts and thoughts are entertained without wisdom, all right, that's where wisdom comes in. The world becomes fragmented and filled with complexity. The Buddha called this tendency papanca. This is Pali. I think maybe in many books you find the Sanskrit word is prapanca. Prapanca, right? So, but this is Pali. So papanca. which is actually conceptual proliferation. Okay? So basically, when we talk about taming our thoughts or taming our mind, we are talking about understanding what is Papanca, what is conceptual or sometimes called mental proliferation. So this word is not easy to translate. In fact, I got a few words here. Some translations, just to pick up some from Ajahn Thanisaro and Dr. Andrew Olensky. So they have defined Papanca as thoughts that spread out or proliferate. Okay, it's an illusion, it's an obsession. Okay, it's a source of conflict and pain. It's a source of conflict and pain. Now, there's a verse in Dhammapada there. It says, people delight in proliferation. Because we delight in proliferation, we are caught in tangles and, we're caught in tangles. So that's why I said, tangles within, tangles without, in the Jata Sutta. So how do we get out of that? So we are caught. It says that Tathagata, that's the Buddha, in non-proliferation. So you got the Pali word Papanca, so you also got the other word that said the Buddha is Nipapanca, like the word Nibbana. Nipapanca. So the Buddha is not caught in mental proliferation, but all of us are, okay? Because of our concept, our attachment to the concepts. And that is linked to this concept of the self, the belief that we have a permanent self, that this is I, this is me, and so on. Okay? In fact, in the Madhupindika Sutta, it explained this, but if you have read the Madhupindika Sutta, you remember that it started actually with this Brahmin called Dandapani, right? Dandapani, who actually approached the Buddha and asked the Buddha, can you tell me what is it that you teach? What is the essence of your teachings? All right? And the Buddha says, my teaching is, I teach people not to quarrel with others. I teach people not to quarrel with others. So in my teachings, if you follow my teachings, you don't end up quarreling with others. Of course, when Dandapani in the story, in the commentary, says he's a Sakyan, one of those proud Sakyan who didn't quite believe in the Buddha's teaching. He said, and then the sutta has got a very animate expression. He said, when Dandapani heard the Buddha saying that my teaching is about non-conflict, about not getting into quarrels with others. He said that this Dandapani, he was kind of, just walk away, and he said, he must be in his mind, he must thinking, you're talking rubbish, how could there be such a thing? So Dandapani never benefited from the Buddha's teachings on that. But subsequently, if you look at that sutta, is actually here when he said, dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arise. All this is actually given by his senior monk Kachayana. All right. So sometimes you find in the discourses, not all the teachings are actually given by the Buddha. Some of them are actually given by his great disciples. Yeah. Like this discourse, Madhupindika Sutta. Actually, the Buddha only say a few words. After that, he said a few cryptic words, then he went to retire in his hut. And then all the monks were a bit baffled. Actually, what does the Buddha mean? So Kachayana, they say, hey, Kachayana, then you better explain what the Buddha meant by that. All right. So sometimes you find that in the Buddha's teachings, he actually gave his disciples. All right. Today we say he delegated that to his disciples. Right. Another good example is the Samaditi Sutta. Very important discourse about right views. Isn't it? Right views. We only hear the word right views, but actually there's a whole discourse on right views. And that discourse actually was not given by the Buddha, it was given by Sariputta, for example. So you can see here that the great teachers of the Buddha, whatever they teach, they also very consistent with actually the overall Buddha's teachings, being great arahants, all of them. So in this Madhupindika Sutta, by the way, Madhu, you know the word Madhu, right? In Malay, isn't it? You know what does Madhu means? Honey, right? So this discourse is called honey ball discourse. It's called honey ball discourse because at the end of when Mahakachayana has explained this, And then as usual, Ananda was there. So Ananda said, "Oh, this is a beautiful sutta, it's wonderful, so pleasant." Right? Then the Buddha said, no. Then he said, "It's so beautiful, so pleasant. It's like honey." Then Buddha said, "Oh, you can call it the honey ball sutta." so very naturally, so the Buddha said. So you can also see the very humanness of the Buddha himself. So the Buddha was a very human person in that sense. All right. So he could appreciate all those things. Anyway, in this discourse, so this is actually the basis of the Madhupindika Sutta, right? Which I already explained just now briefly in the Sabha Sutta. It says, depending on the I and forms, I consciousness arise. So likewise, we can repeat this, the other 5. So depending on the ear and sound, then ear consciousness arise, and so on. So I'll not go into those details. So let's just use the I. So here it says, depending on the I. So you have the I, which is the organ, and then the forms, the visible objects. I consciousness will arise. The meeting of the three is contact. If there's only the I, but there's no form, then there's no contact. If there's only the I, there is the form, but there's no consciousness, then there's also no contact. Right? So the first point is contact, phassa, isn't it? And you look at the dependent origination, there's the word phassa, contact, right? So when contact as condition, there is feeling. All right, so when there's contact, feeling arises. Now in Buddhism, feelings is slightly different from emotions in that sense. Feeling will be basically, as you all understand when you practice the Satipatthana, feelings is always pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Right? Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. But you can expand it into bodily feeling. So bodily feeling, which is pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Or mental feeling, so which is pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. So there are altogether 9 aspects of it. So, the numbers keep on increasing, okay? So from contact, you have got feeling. When one feels, that's where perception comes in. All right? So you look at the first one, when there's contact, it's just contact. It is just bare awareness in that sense. There's no mental proliferation in that sense. When there's feelings, for example, that's why in meditation we are taught to observe. Depending on whatever method that you follow, you just observe it as feelings. But when you feel, then perception takes place. And one perceives, one thinks about it. Now this word, the perception is sanya, right? So when one thinks, here the word Buddha used is vitakka. You also use to investigate, right? Vitakka, vichara. I mean, you talk about investigative thoughts, okay? So when one perceives, one thinks about it. And when one thinks about, one mentally proliferates. So because of vitakka, vichara, one thinks about it, then you get papanca, then you proliferate. Now what is it that you proliferate? You proliferate most of the time, maybe 99.9%, of the past, of the future, sometimes of the present forms cognizable to the eye and other senses. So this forms the very basis of the Madhupindika Sutta. So then we go on, and then we see, like for example, contact. So I'm just going to skip this very quickly. So what is contact? Simultaneous coming together of a sense organs, a sense object, and a moment of consciousness. So this is basic awareness. It's merely an episode of knowing. So when there's contact, as I said just now, it just be basic awareness, no content or qualities of its own. All of our experience are provided by our feelings, our perception, and our volitional formations. So as you know, again in the 12-spoke Paticca Samuppada, the volitional condition will be your sankharas. That's where we create karma, isn't it? Correct? We create karma. Okay? Awareness itself, if we can reach it under all the world and spin, is tranquil and luminous. All right? So the Buddha used the word pabasara. You remember the word pabasara means luminous. So actually there's nothing, so that's why awareness. That's why in Buddhist meditation we talk about going back to awareness. How do we go? Because our mind As I think the first verse in the book of 1 of the Anguttara Nikaya, in the Papanca Sutta, the Buddha says the mind is actually luminous. But the mind becomes defiled because of adventitious thoughts. The mind becomes defiled because of all these papanchas. Because of all this, the translation used is adventitious thoughts. Okay? So the mind by itself is luminous. Okay? So this is very similar to the basic Mahayana teaching that we all have the Buddha nature. Okay? In the Mahayana tradition, of course, they expanded it. They have the concept of the Tathagata Garbha. I'm sure you've heard of Tathagata Garbha, which you don't find in the Theravada, in the Pali teachings. But in the Pali teachings, the closest we have is the first sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, where the Buddha talks that the mind is Pabhasara, is luminous. So the mind is pure in that sense. Okay? So awareness itself, if you can reach it under all the world and spin, is actually tranquil and luminous. So we talk about perception, we talk about feelings. Let's talk about perception. So in perception, it is a mental function that makes sense of what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, or think. So it provides cognitive information on objects of experience. These are images, words, or symbols which we learn in our culture, right? In very specific ways. So we see our world through as and by means of perceptions, and more often than not, project them into the world. Okay? So I always remember this concept of perception, like in meditation. Many years ago when I first started learning, some of you know the late Bhante Suvano, right? You heard of him or maybe even have met him. He once told us that when he was sharing experience of someone doing meditation, and one was an Indian man, one was a Chinese man. So this Indian man, after a couple of meditation sessions, he says that, he told Bhante, he said, I think I'm now able to see the devas. All right? Then Bhante asked him, oh, you can see the devas. How does devas look like? Oh, they look like the Indian god that I have at home. Then the Chinese person also said he has seen devas. Then likewise, the Chinese person the devas he sees doesn't resemble the Indian devas, but the Chinese devas, maybe the Topek Kong, So this is our cultural perceptions, right? So what happens, right? So the thing is, when such thoughts arise, you let it go. You don't cling to it. Just let it go, all right? They may not be devas at all. They could be just your false perception. All right. That's why it's called sanya vipalasa. You heard of this word, right? Sanya vipalasa. That means the false perception. All right, or false perception, or it could be views, ditti vipalasa. So all these things are actually due to our cultural orientation. Okay. And they are created by our mind. Okay? So this is Papanca. So we see our world through as by means of our perceptions. Thinking. And then here in the Madhupindika Sutta, the Buddha said that what one thinks about, one mentally proliferates. So if you have been doing meditation for a long time, and you always been reading about devas, then in your mind, if you're an Indian, then you think of Indian devas. If you're Chinese, you think of Chinese devas. If you're European, probably you think of angels with wings, flying about, coming to bow down to you, and all those things. But whatever it is, all these are just mental images. So in our meditation practice, we just told to, just acknowledge it, okay? Just let it go. Don't cling to it. Okay? So what one thinks about that, one mentally proliferates. So mental proliferation is simply thinking run amok. All right, that is just run amok. While it is not necessarily a problem to think, there's nothing wrong to think. Some people say, oh, why do I want to learn meditation? So I want to stop thinking. Can you really stop thinking? You really can't, right? Though, of course, right thoughts is preferable to wrong thoughts. Now, in the first of the Eightfold Paths, you find that the Buddha talks about right thoughts and wrong thoughts, isn't it? So thoughts they are there. It's a question of how do we transform our thoughts from negative to positive. so that our thoughts, we will not get entangled in those thoughts. We untangle our thoughts. All right, so that's what is mind. So once we get to the level of mental proliferation, we are seriously off course, and nothing good can come of it. Now, what is it that actually causes all these things? Okay. So proliferation. So as the mind moves through the stages of assembling experience, from awareness to perception to thinking to proliferation. So as you can see, it's a stage, isn't it? There are steps. You know, it doesn't just happen by itself. It is what you call a conditioning process. Remember, it starts with the I, and then the I consciousness, and then the I, then the object, and then it goes to contact. From contact, it goes to feelings to perception, perception to thinking, and thinking to mental proliferation. It's a whole process. So understanding the mind means we understand that all this mental process goes through it. Okay? So as the mind moves through the stages of assembling experience, from awareness to perception to thinking to proliferation, remember awareness at the beginning stage when there's contact, right? There's no prejudgment, okay? It moves further and further into the realm of macro construction, proliferation. So as each step, we see less of things as they are and more of things as we construe them to be. Isn't it? And why did we all learn Vipassana meditation? What is the purpose of Vipassana meditation? Ultimately, so that we see things as they really are. Right? Isn't that the purpose? Okay? So meditation practice works to reverse this process. Okay? So it helps us go back to see things as they really are. And we'll talk about it in a short while. But all these things happens because of that underlying tendencies that we all have. Now, this is not mentioned in the sutta itself. These three, craving, conceit, and views, not mentioned in the sutta, but mentioned in the commentary to the sutta. It's a commentary, the Atthakatha, to the sutta itself. It says that that all this proliferation is because linked to this concept of a self, this false notion of a self. Okay? And it is in the commentary to the sutta itself, it explains these three things. So if you read the sutta, you will not find these three words per se, but if you read the commentaries to the sutta, then this is explained. The commentaries, of course, is the one explained by Buddha Gosha, right? So craving, conceit, and views. All right? So craving is tanha, I think we all know that. Conceit is mana, and views is ditthi. Okay? Now, craving, I think we know enough of this. So today we don't have time to go into each one of it, but I just leave this with you to explain that in the commentaries, it explain our mental proliferation is because of that false notion of self. And craving arises because of that belief, because of that deep-seated belief that this is mine, it belongs to me. All right? So because of that, we have cravings. Okay? The conceit is mana. This is what I am. I'm a person. All right. And if you remember, in the traditional Theravada teachings on the 4 stages of enlightenment, you find that even a person who attained the first stage, second stage, they still have mana. Right? It's only at the final stage arahant. So it's a very deep-seated. All right. That is why there's a word in Pali they call asmin mana. I think there's a sutta where I think it's Kema, the monk, the old monk. I think it's Kema Sutta or Keminda Sutta. I can't remember. You can check that. Where this monk was very old and he was asked. He said that you've reached very high stage of enlightenment. You have you actually got rid of all defilements? He said, yeah, everything I seem to have got rid of everything, but there's still something that very, very subtle, It's like you have the flower has all been pulled out, and there's no more flower, but somehow that fragrance, that smell is still there. So that is called mana. It's a very subtle, so even until the final stage, it is still there. So all of us obviously have got mana, right? Okay? Even if we are whatever stages we are, unless you are full-fledged arahant, right? Because the only said is pull out at the stage of that. So this is what I am a person. So conceit here is not just pride. Usually when we talk about conceit, we always think, like haughty, very proud. No, I think I'm better than you. But here, you can have that thought: I'm better than you, I'm inferior to you, or I'm equal to you. So that's still because of that false concept of the self. And finally, the concept of views. This is myself, and this is me. So views, of course, is very strongly rooted in our belief. So these are considered the underlying tendencies. Okay, the anusayas, the tendency, the underlying tendencies. We all have because of the concept of self. So that is why the Buddha says that when we see things as they really are, means to see things as things are subject to change, anicca. Because things are subject to change, they are not satisfactory, isn't it? Whatever things that you like, you want it to remain the way it is, but it's not going to happen, isn't it? So as a result of that, it is unsatisfactory. And whatever it is unsatisfactory, whatever is subject to change, something that you cannot control. Can you say it is mine? Can you say it is me? You can't. So that is why we start with say meditation on breathing or on the body, for example, right? But can you tell your body stop growing old? You can't. All right? You can't even tell your heart not to stop beating. So certain things is just beyond your control. Because it's beyond your control. So Buddha says, how can it be me? How can it be myself? Right? But that does not mean that you don't exist. You exist in a conventional sense. But in the ultimate sense, there's no I, there's no me. During the Buddha's time, he used the analogy of a chariot. When all the parts of the chariot are there, the chariot exists. But when you pull out, you take the different parts of the chariot away, there's no chariot. Right? So similarly, this human body or mind and body is just mind and matter. So it is not a self. So this is the underlying tendencies that, because of that deep-seated belief in that self, so we proliferate our ideas based on these three things. So craving, all this, because of time, I'm not going to go through this, so you know what this means, craving, and then you got conceit, all right? I'm superior, I'm equal, and I'm inferior. And then the views. So you take what is permanent for impermanent, take what is happiness for suffering, and what takes for self, what is not self, to the deeply held belief that there is an enduring self. Right? So the Buddha, nowhere in the teaching does he say we don't exist. It's just that we don't have this concept of an enduring self. Okay? So no one in the world whose desires are always fulfilled, in whose life everything happens according to one's wishes without anything unwanted happening. Things constantly occur that are contrary to our desires and wishes. So the question arises, how can we stop reacting blindly when confronted with things that we don't like? How can we stop creating tension and remain peaceful and harmonious? So that's the essence of the Madhupindika Sutta, because the Buddha says, my teaching is not to create conflict. So how do we have peace and harmony in our lives? Okay, so this is the question that was asked here. So on a very elementary level, if we got a problem, if you feel anger, for example, the conscious solution, we get up, take a glass of water, we start drinking, your anger won't multiply. So you do something else. You replace it with something else. Now this is a very mundane example, right? You really want to look at the details. The Buddha actually talks about 5 ways how you can remove your distracting thoughts, isn't it? Right? That's you can read that. Is given in another discourse called the Vitakka Santana Sutta. I'm sure you have heard of that, Vitakka Santana Sutta, where the Buddha talks about 5 ways how you can remove distracting thoughts like anger or pride and so on. So we don't have time to talk about that, but it's very beautifully explained there. Okay, so you start counting mentally 1, 2, 3, 4, or you start repeating a word, a phrase, or a mantra. The mind will be diverted and soon be free of negative anger. So here, if you proliferate, then a lot of anger arise. Then the advice is that just do something that's the reverse of it, right? Distract distract your anger. Okay, you distract your anger. But this is at a conscious level. So by diverting the attention, you push the negativity deep into the subconscious. And there you continue to generate and multiply the same defilement. So you have not removed it. You are only pushing it down to your subconscious when you do that. Of course, it's better than not doing that. Because if you don't do that, you may end up fighting or quarreling. Right? So, but you push it down. Okay? So on the surface, there's a layer of peace and harmony. But in the depths of the mind, there's a sleeping volcano of suppression, negativity. Isn't it? We soon not may erupt in violent expression. So that is why we talk about like samatha meditation and vipassana meditation. So what we just mentioned is very much like samatha. You build up the concentration, you kind of suppress it, but it doesn't uproot it. You look at the life of the Siddhartha Gautama before he became the Buddha. So he was practicing samatha. He was able to attain all the high jhanas and so on, but that wasn't the ultimate. Okay, so that's only suppression. So the aim of vipassana, for example, is to do with looking deeply into the mind and body to discern the various processes unfolding each moment that fabricate the virtual world of our experience. So the riot of conceptual proliferation, often the first thing one sees, because it is the shallowest and busiest part of the mind. So if you look at what the Buddha explains about our mind, first we have the very gross defilements which arise through our mental proliferation. Okay? Maybe you are someone who practice strongly to the 5 precepts, okay, that you are able to, you will not, for example, go to someone and punch him, right? Okay? But you will still have a lot of anger. All right? So the Buddha talks about our defilements at 3 levels. So at the very gross levels, all right, maybe if you hold strongly to your precepts, you can overcome it. Okay? But there's another level at the intermediate level, like what we say when the anger is somewhere hidden in the subconscious. All right? So you need meditation to help you to actually, in that manner, just to suppress it. But it doesn't pull it out. So it's only at the highest level, all right, at the vipassana level, that's where you pull out, you uproot, all right, you uproot all those things, okay? So in the traditional Buddhist terminology, you may have heard of this word called vitikama, that means at the gross level, and the pariyutthana, and then at the anusayas. Anusayas will be really the underlying, the tendencies, the deep-seated tendencies. Only vipassana meditation can actually uproot that. Right? So all schools of Buddhism will teach you that, not only in the Theravada. Like in the Tibetan schools, so when we talk about vipassana, it's actually when you really see emptiness. So when you see emptiness, it's actually pulling out, that you find that actually it's all empty. So in the Tibetan tradition, right, so it's actually using vipassana to actually seeing emptiness itself, right? So that will obliterate all the papanchas that you have. So that is why we always start with mindfulness, isn't it? So mindfulness, so whatever you see, you must be mindful of as it really is. Whatever you hear, you must be aware of it as it occurs. Whatever you smell, you must be aware of it really occurs. Whatever you taste, and whatever you touch, and whatever you think, aware of it really occurs. Okay? So there's a very good book, because this is a very difficult topic. This book is called Concept and Reality. It's not an easy book to read, but if you are really interested in this, this is written by the late Bhikkhu Nyanananda. I think it's a result of this book called Concept and Reality that this word Papanca actually became popular. But if you find this book too difficult to read, because I think it's like probably his PhD thesis or something, right? There's another more contemporary, is by Andrew Olansky. It's called Untangling the Self. It's called Untangling the Self, where it actually talks about Papanca. Okay? All right, so I'll just leave you with that short reflection. So I think it's, remember this, there's a discourse the Buddha gave to Bahiya. You remember the discourse to Bahiya? who, the old monk, I think he told the Buddha, you better tell me what is the essence of your teaching. Finally, the Buddha told him, in the seeing, there's only the seen, in the hearing, there's only the heard, all right? And then he said that after that, he became enlightened, but then he was killed by a bull run wild or something. Okay? So that's the story of Bahiya. Right? So it's something along that. Okay, so I think I'll stop here and just a short reflection. So if anything has been useful, I hope you take it with you, and if it's not, just leave it behind. Don't get attached to it, or don't get upset with it, okay? Don't create more Papanca. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Any questions, brothers and sisters?
Hi, Brother Benny. Just to ask this question. Where is the mind? Because I think it may sound very simple yet very complex like that. Most people know the brain is here, but is the brain the mind? Perhaps I appreciate if you can share some thoughts on this subject. Yeah.
Well, this mind-brain dichotomy, I think, has been talked about, for a long time, right? So, because the mind, when we talk about the mind and then we talk about the brain has been matter, right? So the popular response is, what is the mind? The mind is no matter. So what is the matter? Never mind. So there's a lot of, so basically when we talk about the mind, all right, we talk about mind and matter, right? So what constitutes the mind? Mind is just what? Perceptions, feelings, mental process. That is what we call a mind. So the word mind itself, if you use the word nama as mind, it is nothing but just a set of aggregates. When it coming together of all these elements or all these processes, then we call it the mind. Whereas the brain is more of an organ, isn't it? More of an organ. And in Buddhism, but increasingly in the other traditions, the mind is also equivalent to the heart, right? Isn't it? The heart, sin, right? So, but the word heart is hadaya, isn't it? Hadaya, but usually the Sanskrit is hardaya, right? So the mind and the heart. So mind, heart is closer than the mind and the brain in that sense, right? So what is mind? Mind is just those processes that we talk about: feelings, perceptions, mental activities, right? And consciousness, right? That's from the Buddhist perspective. If you are interested in this mind-life thing, mind and brain thing, there's a website called Mind Life Institute. If you Google that, Mind Life Institute, there's a lot of podcasts. You can listen to the podcast. There's a series of talks about the mind, about the brain. How does the mind influence the brain, and how does the brain also influence the mind? So I think there's a lot of scientific research, and every year, I think even now, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he will have meetings with neuroscientists, with biologists and all those things to discuss about the mind and things. But one thing we know about the mind from the Buddhist perspective is the mind is something that is malleable. The mind is something that can change, that can transform. All right. So as a result of this dialogue between Buddhist psychology and science, so I think you have heard of this word called neuroplasticity. Yeah. All right. So neuroplasticity basically says that the mind is malleable. You can transform the mind. And the whole of Buddhist teachings is actually about transforming the mind, transforming the negative mind to the positive mind. All right? So if you look at mind in that sense, how to transform negativities to positivities. All right? So there's a lot of research now on the mind and Buddhism. Okay.
Thank you, brother, for that really enlightening talk. You had one slide that talked about thinking and context. If you can go back to that. My interpretation of context may be quite different from yours. Do you mind just explaining do you have a real life example what context means in this sense? I think, not this one.
This context?
before that. Sorry, yeah, go on.
That's all I have.
No, after that.
After this, our thoughts?
Concepts and thoughts. Go back. I think it's concept and thoughts.
Concepts. Is it concepts or content?
Yeah, I think it's concept.
Concepts.
Yeah.
Concepts from the Buddhist perspective, they are just ideas, and concepts are, of course, conditions. Our concepts are conditioned by our past, by our culture, so it arises concepts. So the Buddhist approach is just to see concepts as conventional truth, not as ultimate truth. All right, so that's the Buddhist approach to look at concepts. There's nothing wrong with concepts, but we are told not to be attached to concepts because they are just ideas. Because, for example, time is a concept. It's not real in that sense. Because we are 10:15 now in Malaysia, but it's maybe 10 p.m. in New York. But it is real in a conventional sense, but it's not real in the ultimate sense. So Buddha talks about conceptual truth and ultimate truth. All right, so we operate at two levels of reality: conceptual reality and ultimate reality. So it doesn't mean that when concepts are not real, they are real in the sense of for our everyday communication, right? And Buddha make it very clear. All right, so there are two levels. Even when we talk, we use conventional language. We cannot use ultimate language. We cannot go around saying, "Oh, you are Namarupa one, Namarupa." You can't. We have a name within it. So that's a concept. So it is real as far as that is the case. So it is true. All right. So it's a concept. The Buddha uses the word lokiya. That means it's mundane. All right, lokiya. So mundane lokiya satcha. That means it's a mundane truth. It is real. But the difference with the Buddha is because of our concept, we are caught in the concept because of that self. Because this is my concept. So my concept must be true. Your concept cannot be true. So because I feel so strongly in my concepts, so I say it is true. So concepts will lead to proliferation, mental proliferation. So that's why you use the word conceptual proliferation. So these two words, they're very close. Concept is panyati, and the mental proliferation is papanca. So from concepts, it leads to mental proliferation. So it is true, yes, it is real in the conventional sense, but not real in the ultimate sense. Okay? So that's concept, not contact, yeah? Yeah, okay.
Dear brother, Danny, I was thinking about, you are talking about thoughts, physical liberation. What's about positive thoughts? What's about thoughts of passion? If we keep on thinking about it, does it lead us to new freedom? Proliferating. Like for the government thinking, oh, there's a flood, we must give help, we must do this, do that. Would people thinking like that lead them to liberation, or does it lead them to otherwise? So how does positive thoughts then come into the picture for this liberty?
Yeah. Again, at a conventional level, because in Buddhism there's a lot of emphasis on conventional truth. So, like for example, we talk about doing good, avoiding evil, all right? And so when thoughts arise, so in the Noble Eightfold Path, you've got one section called right thoughts, right? So what are the type of thoughts we should cultivate, we should develop? So obviously we have to develop positive thoughts, all right? Or thoughts of kindness, thoughts of compassion, thoughts of, generosity, rather than the reverse. Okay, so that is obviously necessary, especially when we need to live in society. But if you remember that saying, avoid evil, do good, purify the mind. You find that avoiding evil, yes, that's very important. Doing good is also very important, but that's not the whole story. Because ultimately, when you avoid evil, so you don't do bad karma, When you do good, you do a lot of good karma. But when you do a lot of good karma, it only means that you continue to be reborn again and again in samsara. So that is why, ultimately, this is where it gets a bit tricky. You use your understanding of doing good to even transcend goodness. That's why you purify the mind. When the mind sees that we have to avoid even beyond doing good and avoiding evil. And the Buddha gave this very clearly in a discourse. You may have heard of that discourse. It's called the Kukura Vatika Sutta. So you can Google this. It's called the Kukura Vatika Sutta, where the Buddha was talking to two persons. One person was practicing what is called dog ascetic practices, and the other person doing the cow ascetic practices. And he was explaining to them that while it is definitely necessary for us to do good, to avoid evil, but ultimately to avoid being stuck in this cycle of birth and rebirth, we have to transcend even karma. That's why it says good karma leads to good results, bad karma leads to bad results. Good karma and bad karma leads to good and bad results, which I think most of us do, right? We do a combination of them. The final one is neither good karma nor bad karma leads to neither good nor bad results. So the fourth one, if you Google the Kukura Vatika Sutta, it explains why we should, but ultimately we get out of it. I hope it's not too confusing. Because, so here on one hand we are told, yes, we must do good. Yeah, there's no question about it. But when you do good, it only means that you get reborn again and again. But the ultimate in Buddhist teachings, not only in the Theravada, I think in all schools, is ultimately to get out of samsaric existence. And the only way you can get out is to nullify your karma. So the actions of the Buddhas and enlightened beings, their karmic actions doesn't generate new karma. Our actions generate new karma. So that's why the enlightened beings, their karma, they are called ahosi karma. The Hokkien people say hosi, ahosi karma or kiriya. That means inoperative. Whereas our karma will operate. So that is why we get reborn and again. Okay? So if you have to be reborn again, it's better to do good, isn't it? Right? And the Buddha also gives specific examples, like in the Salayaka Sutta. In the Salayaka Sutta, the Buddha explains, if you want to be born in the heavenly realms, what you have to do. The Buddha even explained that. So it doesn't mean that you should not aspire to do that. But with right view, you understand that that is not ultimate. But of course, that's better than being reborn in the hell realms, isn't it? Surely you want to be reborn in the heavenly realms. If you want that to happen, then you read the Salayaka Sutta. The Buddha explains how you can do it. Right? And that is also common in the other traditions, like in the Tibetan traditions, when we study and practice the Lamrim. All right? So you find that there are three scopes of beings. One scope is you do good, and then you are just reborn in the higher realms. You know, another scope, you have no more rebirth. Third scope, you aspire to be a Buddha. So it's also found in all these different Buddhist traditions, but given different emphasis.